Hey friends, tonight we're not diving into epic battles or glittering royal banquets. Nope. Instead, you're about to get yanked straight into the Middle Ages, a time when taking a bath was basically a one-way ticket to the plague. Body odor was a gold medal of honor, and your neighbor could toss garbage out the window like it was nothing, and sleep soundly afterward. Before you hug your pillow and dream about your modern-day shower with water pressure and scented shampoo, do me a favor. Hit that like button, subscribe if you love bizarre historical tales that sound too strange to be real, and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from and what time it is right now. Seriously? It's a blast seeing who's trudging through the mud of history with us from every corner of the world. Now, dim the lights, turn on that fan for a soft, sleepy hum, and let's step into a world where clean was just a foolish dream reserved for the hopelessly naive. At the beginning of the Middle Ages, bathing was actually considered a good thing. Not everyone had the luxury of soaking weekly, of course. But the idea that warm water could cleanse the body still lingered, especially in monasteries, where monks preserved the Roman tradition of regular washing. In some parts of Europe, public bathhouses were still being built and used, places for hygiene, socializing, and occasionally a quiet spot to rest between prayers. But over time, particularly by the later Middle Ages, what was once seen as healthy began to look suspicious, even dangerous. Not because the water was dirty, no, the problem was the water itself. That innocent, soothing liquid suddenly became the prime suspect in every health disaster. From the sniffles to plagues that could silence an entire city in a single week. So, what changed? A delicate mix of fear, superstition, and a medical system completely lacking in both bacteria and basic logic. People believed that hot water opened the pores, which, to be fair, isn't entirely wrong. But it's what they believed happened next that took a sharp detour from reality. According to the logic of the time, once your pores were open, illness, lurking like a back-alley thief, would slip right in and make itself at home. And so, bathing stopped being a way to cleanse the body. It became an act of recklessness, a gamble, like opening the castle gates to enemy troops. Sitting in a warm bath now meant wondering whether you had just issued a formal invitation to the Black Death. This wasn't just a fringe belief held by a few particularly anxious villagers. It spread widely, becoming a dominant part of how people thought about health. Ironically, that fear spread like the very diseases they were hoping to avoid. By the 13th and 14th centuries, many bathhouses, once considered centers of wellness, began earning a darker reputation. Some were turned into shady inns. Others operated more like brothels than spas. And when the church looked into those steaming tubs and saw temptation, sin, and flesh instead of soap and steam, bathing became more than a medical threat. It became a moral one, a soggy sin. Scrubbing, once a sign of cleanliness, was now a suspicious activity. To be clear, not everyone stopped bathing entirely, but soaking in warm water, fully exposed, without any divine blessing beforehand, that became something most folks, especially the lower classes, simply didn't feel safe doing. Not because they enjoyed being filthy, but because being dry was seen as more holy, and frankly, a lot more modest. After all, being naked was one thing, but being naked in hot water, that was basically a personal invitation to the devil himself. So, they declined, not for lack of soap, but for an abundance of caution. Still, that didn't mean people were wandering around caked in mud like medieval goblins. They did try to stay clean, in more careful, cautious ways. Hands, faces, and feet were still wiped down with damp cloths. Some folks even used herbal mouth rinses, homemade medieval mouthwash, to fight off odor and evil spirits at the same time. But full body bathing? That became rare. Only the very rich, the very brave, or the very itchy dared to do it. That fear didn't come from laziness. On the contrary, it came from a very medieval attempt to survive in a world without germ theory, vaccines, plumbing, or reliable soap. It's hard to blame anyone for avoiding anything that might speed up their next meeting with a priest. Back then, bathhouses had once been community centers, places to gather, to wash, to chat, and occasionally to play a round of chess in the steam. But those days quickly gave way to collective paranoia. The bath was no longer a symbol of cleanliness. It became a gateway to sin, or, at the very least, the common cold. And so, staying dry became a survival strategy. No one could prove that a towel could protect them from the plague, but it could protect them from the whispers at church on Sunday morning. And in that world, that was enough. In a time when warm water was suspicious, wet cloths were used sparingly, and prayers carried more weight than disinfectants, bathing became a luxury, not just of money, but of the spirit. Those who did bathe did so quietly, usually in their bedrooms near the hearth, with a curtain drawn and a few herbs plucked fresh from the garden. The bath itself resembled soup more than a spa, but still, they bathed, even if it meant whispering a prayer of forgiveness between rising clouds of steam. In that era, simply not bathing was a survival tactic. As for smelling pleasant, that was a dream no one dared to dream. Have you ever been to a modern spa, soaking in a warm tub, sipping herbal tea, and thought, you know what this place needs? A few nosy merchants and an old woman telling ghost stories. If so, then a medieval public bathhouse might just be your dream destination. Fewer scented candles, sure, but far more steam, and even more gossip. In the early days, these bathhouses were the medieval version of a community spa day. Townsfolk, from monks and middle-class nobles to salt traders, would show up, peel off a few layers of wool, and ease into murky hot water. Privacy? Not much of a concern. After all, you were already shoulder to shoulder in church and elbow to elbow in the market. Sharing a steamy bath didn't exactly push anyone's boundaries. Here, you could hear all about the baker's wife's latest pie disaster, or speculate on next week's wool prices. And if someone soaked just a little too long, they weren't called lazy, they were suspicious. Maybe hiding a strange red rash, maybe hiding an affair, maybe hiding both. But around the 13th century, the public bathhouse started to evolve. And not in the free massage upgrade kind of way. More like the things got a little too cozy kind of way. These bathhouses began offering extra services like, need someone to scrub your back? Or, this attendant is very friendly, perhaps too friendly. It didn't take long for bathhouses to develop a certain reputation. Half hygiene hub, half whatever the church would rather not describe. Some bathhouses started to resemble pre-industrial nightclubs. There was steam, there was laughter, there was homemade booze, and there were activities that priests would label as immoral, unsanitary, and wildly unregulated. Unfortunately for this budding spa industry, the church wasn't a fan of the combo package, nudity and laughter. To them, bathing was supposed to be a simple, humble act, preferably done alone, in the dark, with a little bit of shame. Not in a crowded room, where someone was scrubbing your shoulders while recounting their time in prison. And so, religious leaders began to frown upon these bubbling bathhouses. Bathing became associated with sin, with lust, with a slow, soapy descent into moral decay. What began as a method of cleansing slowly morphed into a symbol of societal rot. Then, the worst happened. It wasn't peeling backs from over-scrubbing that shut things down. No, it was the Black Death. The plague had arrived, and while people scattered, scrambling for survival, the bathhouses, already under ecclesiastical suspicion, became the perfect scapegoat. I mean, who in their right mind takes a bath during a plague? Only those who fear neither death nor common sense. Rumors spread that those steaming tubs, where folks sat together elbow to elbow, weren't places of hygiene anymore, but lairs of disease. Or worse, open invitations for the devil to stroll in through your freshly loosened pores. So, one by one, the bathhouses shut down. Many were abandoned entirely. Their walls went mossy, their roofs crumbled, like forgotten temples to cleanliness. Some were repurposed as bakeries. Perhaps someone figured, if we can't soak in warm water, we might as well bake bread in hot ovens. A few even became livestock pens. And yes, you can imagine the delightful aroma of that particular design decision. Surprisingly, no one really protested. There were no rallies for bathing rights, no petitions crying, "Reopen the tubs." People simply accepted it, almost gratefully. Staying dry, it seemed, was now the only way to stay healthy and holy. The bathhouses, once full of splashing water, hushed conversations, and the occasional suspicious giggle, fell silent. Some were boarded up completely, as if to erase the shame of what once happened inside. Others decayed into historical relics, mildewed bricks, shattered windows, and the lingering scent of yesterday's steam. Perhaps, somewhere, an old man remembered those blissful days, soaking with neighbors, chatting while his back was still supple and the church still relatively chill. But now, it was all gone, like a dream, damp, steamy, and nailed shut. And so, the medieval public bathhouse, once a symbol of community, and if you were lucky, smooth skin, quietly vanished from everyday life. Not because it wasn't useful, but because it was a little too useful, in ways the church could never quite tolerate. So what happened when you didn't bathe? That's the obvious question. If you lived in the Middle Ages and were thoroughly convinced that warm water was a gateway to hell, or at the very least, a fast track to dying of the plague, you'd need an alternative. And of course, medieval folks had one. They might not have had soap bubbles or blow dryers, but they mastered the fine art of pretending to be clean, a delicate craft that required both strategy and imagination. No showers, no heart-shaped bathtubs, but they had linen cloth, a small piece of fabric dipped into slightly warm water, sometimes enhanced with a drop or two of sage or lavender oil hurriedly harvested from the backyard. And voila! The primary weapon in the noble quest to smell like a decent human. They didn't call it a spa, they called it surviving with dignity. The most common hygiene routine: wipe hands, wipe face, wipe feet, in exactly that order. Because understandably, no one wanted to confuse what had just stepped in horse dung with what was about to touch their forehead during prayer. As for the rest of the body, well, if it was covered by 4 layers of wool, 1 fur vest, and a tightly cinched leather belt, then did the dirt really exist? The answer back then was, can't see it, can't smell it, doesn't count. Full-body bathing was considered ambitious, reserved for 3 kinds of people: the extremely rich, the extremely reckless, or the extremely itchy. The first group could afford to pay servants to boil water, carry it to their chambers, and pour it into a wooden tub lined with linen, a sort of body soup, steaming with hope. The second group, reckless souls, were those who thought, maybe the plague will spare me because I used dried daisies. And the third, well, they had no choice. When you scratch through your wool so hard it sparks, you know it's time to do the unthinkable: soak. The average person had fewer options. They settled for a simpler strategy: stay dry and keep the odor tolerable. A quick rub with a damp cloth, a handful of herbs stuffed into your collar, and a silent prayer that today wouldn't be unusually warm. If you looked clean, or at least didn't emit a scent strong enough to knock over a horse, that was good enough. Linen, humble linen, was the quiet hero of hygiene. It absorbed moisture, was easy to wash, and if you changed your underlayers often enough, you were, technically, clean. People believed that laundering your shirt regularly was almost the same as bathing. A crisp, white, odor-free linen shirt wasn't just fashion. It was a social statement stronger than any medieval perfume. It said you weren't just surviving, you were surviving gracefully. Of course, the act of pretending to be clean wasn't perfect, but it could fool others, and occasionally, even yourself. Brushing your hair, sprinkling herbs in it, dabbing your face with a scented cloth as you passed the fish market. These were small acts of strategic theater. Medieval people didn't have foaming body wash, but they did have the art of olfactory illusion. And we should never underestimate that, because in a world where warm water was treated like a biological weapon, and bathtubs were condemned by the church as gateways to moral collapse, simply trying to keep your face clean was already a heroic act. The truth is, many people chose humility, not because they liked filth, but because they genuinely believed it kept them alive. Occasionally, on special occasions, like childbirth, recovery from illness, or a major religious holiday, people were granted the honor of a full bath. A single soak in warm, rosemary-scented water could feel like a divine blessing. Of course, only if you survived it without catching a cold or being accused of spiritual corruption. Some folks who lived near rivers or natural hot springs would sneak in a secret bath like it was a private sin. As for city dwellers, they chose to live among smells of themselves, their neighbors, and the street, and learned to make peace with it. Body odor became part of the atmosphere, like church bells or the sound of wheels scraping over cobblestones. Everyone had a smell, and everyone politely pretended not to notice. And within all of this, a quiet humor shines through. No one believed they were doing it right, but no one had a better option. In that world, wiping your face with a damp linen cloth was considered romantic. Sprinkling lavender on your neck was a social weapon. And managing to keep your stench without getting kicked out of church, that was a skill. You might be thinking, how awful. But remember, just a few centuries later, the descendants of these fragrant survivors would invent scented soaps, fluffy towels, 24/7 hot water, and even watermelon-scented shower gel. They had to endure the no-bathing years so you could enjoy minty fresh deodorant every morning. So next time you walk into your bathroom, turn on the warm water and watch the steam fog up your mirror. Think of you. Medieval hair, if you're imagining dry bird nests on the verge of liftoff, well, you're not entirely wrong. But not everyone walked around like a tiny hurricane had just passed through their scalp. In fact, many people back then took great pride in their hair. They brushed it daily. They braided it, coiled it, hid it, and sometimes lit candles near it. Not for the mood lighting, but because, well, bedside lamps hadn't been invented yet. One thing is certain, though. Washing your hair back then was an adventure not meant for the faint of heart or the faint of scalp. Let's begin with the classic option: soap made from wood ash and animal fat. This wasn't the kind of soap that lathered nicely or smelled of lavender, and it was definitely not safe for color-treated hair. No, this soap had one mission: strip away oil, and possibly a layer of your scalp if you weren't careful. After just one wash with this concoction, you'd feel clean. Clean in the way a prairie wind sweeps over your bare skin. And if you noticed large clumps of hair falling out, don't panic. That was part of the experience. Back then, baldness wasn't always a sign of aging. Sometimes, it was just the aftermath of a traditional medieval deep cleanse. Now, if ash soap felt a bit too aggressive, there was a gentler option: egg yolk. Yes, egg yolk. Not for breakfast, but for massaging into your scalp. People believed eggs softened the hair, and, to be fair, they might have been right. The problem was, you had to sit in a cold hut with yellow goo trickling down your neck, praying it wouldn't harden into an omelet before you rinsed it out. Nothing quite says refined elegance like shivering while silently cursing your favorite hen. And if you wanted something that was both cleansing and amusingly fragrant, then beer might have been your go-to. Yep, beer. Not to drink, but to pour on your head. It was said to make hair shinier, at least in theory, and would leave you smelling like you just rolled out of a tavern at 3 a.m. Some folks enjoyed the scent. Others claimed it confused lice. But whatever the outcome, you definitely stood out, in a way that made people hesitant to ask what product you were using. But regardless of whether you washed with ash, egg, or ale, no one escaped the true enemy: lice. These uninvited guests didn't care if you were a farmer, a monk, or a noble. As long as you had hair, you had a roof for their parties. And let's be clear, they never paid rent. Brushing your hair, back then, wasn't just about looking neat. It was a daily ritual, partly for grooming, mostly for hunting roommates. A wooden or bone comb was a treasured possession. A finely carved one might even be given as a wedding gift. But instead of elegantly detangling waves, it often served as a survival tool. Every stroke was a purge. Every tangle was a negotiation between your scalp and your patience. Some people heated their combs over the fire, hoping the heat would roast lice eggs alive. Others boiled their headscarves as a scorched earth tactic. And sometimes, when every strategy failed, people simply shaved it all off. Women would hide their bald heads beneath bonnets. Monks declared it a sign of humility. And everyone else? They were just tired. Wigs, if you could get one, were a lifeline for those who'd lost both patience and hair. But ironically, wigs had lice too. Yes, really. Nothing quite screams tragedy like putting on a wig to hide your baldness, only to adopt a brand new outpost of parasites. People tried to mask it all with herbs, rosemary, lavender, mint, but the result was usually a bouquet of desperation wrapped in unbearable itching. Keeping your hair clean wasn't an act of beauty. It was combat, a trial of technique and spirit. And if you could step outside without your hair clumping together, or worse, without anything crawling across your forehead, you'd already won, at least for that morning. You see, modern hair care is an art, but in the Middle Ages, it was a campaign. So the next time you turn on the hot water, grab your bottle of natural coconut shampoo and sigh because your ends feel a little dry. Take a moment to remember those who came before you. The ones who dried their hair with linen, sat in freezing huts with raw eggs sliding down their necks, and still walked out the door like they were headed to a party. A lice party. But hey, they showed up. Do you have a toothbrush? Of course you do. Maybe it's electric, with vibration modes, flashing lights, or even music. If you were brave, or foolish, enough to buy that one on sale. But medieval folks? Not so much. No brushes, no toothpaste, no flossing sensor, just a hopeful smile and a piece of linen dipped in salt. Yes, linen. People in the Middle Ages brushed their teeth, if you could even call it that, by taking a small cloth, often repurposed from worn-out fabric, and soaking it in a simple mix: coarse salt, crushed mint, or if you had plenty of it, ashes. Yes, ashes from the fireplace. They would gently rub it on their teeth like they were dusting off a fragile antique. Effective? Depends. But at least the teeth looked attended to, and that was enough to feel momentarily clean. Want fresh breath? Easy. Chew a twig. Not to eat, just to gnaw on like a medieval snack with no flavor. Slender twigs, especially from hazel or elm trees, were peeled at one end to create something resembling a toothbrush. Nature's biodegradable, unregulated dental device. You'd chew until the fibers frayed, then scrub away. Earth-friendly, fully compostable, mildly gross. Looking to upgrade your oral care routine? Try vinegar. Yes, vinegar. The stuff for fish, salads, and preserving farrows. People used it to rinse their mouths, or strong wine if they were feeling bold and didn't have a sore throat. The sensation? Like swirling mild acid mixed with a hint of regret. But afterward, you'd feel purified. At least, in a way only medieval standards could admire. And toothpaste? Oh, they had that too. Homemade, of course, featuring ingredient lists that would horrify any modern dentist. Crushed charcoal, ground eggshells, powdered oyster shell, all mixed with honey or oil into a gritty paste. In theory, it gently polished the teeth. In practice, it was more like sanding porcelain with fine gravel. Some recipes even added wood dust or ground walnut shell, ingredients that made it feel more like home renovation than hygiene. Why did they go through all that? Because keeping your teeth was always better than losing them. tooth loss, whether from decay or falling off a horse last week, was a medieval nightmare. And if you're thinking, well, they could just go to the dentist, then congratulations. You're about 800 years too early. The dentist back then? Usually, your barber. That's right. The same guy who trimmed your hair in the morning might be yanking out your tooth by afternoon. No anesthesia, no painkillers, no relaxing background music. Just a wooden chair, a pair of iron pliers, and a soft whisper. Start praying. Typically, they'd hand you a cup of liquor, not to disinfect, but to make you dizzy enough not to leap out of the chair halfway through. Then came the tug, swift, brutal, hopeful. A sharp yank, a scream, gentle or not, and fingers crossed, they pulled the right tooth, not the one next to it, just to be safe. There were no fillings, no reshaping, no routine checkups. A tooth hurt? That tooth was gone. Hurt more, pull more, until one day you could whistle through the gaps without needing an actual flute. But let's be fair, not everyone in the Middle Ages had terrible teeth. Shocking, isn't it? Thanks to diets low in refined sugar, many medieval folks, especially peasants, actually had stronger teeth than you'd expect. They ate whole grains, root vegetables, stews, and bread hard enough to be classified as a weapon. If you got cavities, it was probably due to age, or a questionable hobby of chewing rocks. Still, when tooth decay came knocking, and trust me, it always did, no minty toothpaste in the world could save you. Just whispered prayers, and another appointment with the guy who cut your bangs last week. You might think that sounds like a nightmare, but medieval people, they adapted. They learned to chew on one side. They learned not to smile too wide, and they mastered the art of fresh breath by keeping their distance. A slight grin, a nod from afar, and no one knew you only had 7 teeth left. And that was enough. So the next time you're staring in the mirror, holding your anti-vibration electric toothbrush, and frowning because you ran out of cinnamon toothpaste, think of your ancestors, the ones who used old cloth, cold ashes, and raw courage to hold on to a few good teeth. And while no one ever called their smiles dazzling, at least they had the bravery to smile in a world without modern dentistry. A smile missing a few teeth is still a smile. If you've ever stepped out of a crowded train station in the middle of summer and thought, wow, it's richly aromatic here, then congratulations. You've had a tiny glimpse into a perfectly ordinary day in a medieval city. Now, imagine that, but every day, on every street corner, and with absolutely no escape. A medieval city smelled like a symphony. Not the refined kind, but more like an impromptu street performance between unwashed sweat, horse manure, dried fish, and something vaguely resembling a forgotten dream. It wasn't a fragrance. It was a scream. A scent so strong, so loud, you couldn't ignore it. You just had to learn to live inside it. But the people back then, they didn't complain. Not because they couldn't smell it. Oh, they could. But because everyone was in on it. Body odor wasn't shameful. It was a cultural identity. If you smelled nice, people would look at you funny, like you just announced you were from the future. But if you had a scent, well then, congratulations. You were normal. Of course, normal didn't mean they didn't try. They just tried a little differently than we do. Instead of spraying deodorant or using wet wipes, medieval folks went on the defensive with aromatics. One of the most common tools was the pomander, a small hollow ball, often made of silver or brass, filled with cloves, cinnamon, lavender, or, if you were wealthy, musk, an intensely fragrant oil extracted from the scent glands of a deer, and the kind of smell you never really forget, even if you want to. These balls of scent were worn on a chain around the neck, tucked inside a tunic, or clipped to a belt. Basically, a 14th century version of a personal air filter. Did they work? Not really. They didn't erase the smell. They just helped you survive longer in fish markets and alleys where wastewater floated lazily along the curb like a silent, smelly warning. And if you couldn't afford a pomander, herbs to the rescue. People tucked fresh mint, rosemary, or thyme into their sleeves, shirt collars, and even inside their hats. It wasn't just a strategy, it was a social signal. I know I smell, but I'm trying. And sometimes, in that world, trying was already a victory. Perfume, if it existed, was the ultimate luxury. Most of it was imported from the Middle East or Italy, and reserved strictly for the nobility, or for those desperate to be mistaken as nobility. These scents were distilled from roses, orange blossoms, sandalwood, or, and this is no joke, civet, extracted from the anal glands of a cat-like animal. Yes, anal glands. Art has always required sacrifice. Those who wore such perfumes weren't just trying to smell nice. They wanted to be known as someone who could afford to smell nice. If you walked into a medieval banquet and caught a faint trace of jasmine and cinnamon in the air, you could be sure that person was either of noble blood or working very hard to marry into it. Still, no matter what they sprayed, body odor always won. There were no antiperspirants, no 48-hour protection, no fresh mountain air, because the only mountain you could smell was the heap of garbage behind your neighbor's house, and society accepted that. If you smelled nice, it meant you were rich. If you didn't, you were simply one of them. The question was never, why do you smell? But rather, how do you survive everyone else's smell? Women, especially noble women, had a small secret: scented handkerchiefs. They carried them and gently raised them to their noses when passing through crowds. Not for elegance, for internal protection. These handkerchiefs were soaked in lavender water, vinegar, or distilled perfume, just enough to help them keep smiling during summer market days, when the fish stalls were in full swing and the knights had returned from battle, without doing their laundry first. And if you were a commoner, with no coin for perfumes or embroidered linen, you learned to live with your own scent and everyone else's. Sometimes you braided herbs into your hair, hoping the breeze would choose to carry the scent of mint instead of sweat. Sometimes you simply avoided breathing too deeply. The smell of a medieval city wasn't something people tried to escape. It was a fact of life, like church bells or bread so hard it could double as a weapon. It was part of the world. No one was surprised if you smelled. They were only surprised if you didn't. And that was enough. So next time you're lounging on a leather couch in your scented living room, grumbling because the essential oil diffuser ran out of battery, think of your ancestors, the ones who lived through the smell of history and still found ways to love, sing, and write poetry. They didn't have Chanel, but they had a quiet kind of courage, especially when they stepped out the door without any form of deodorant, except patience. And honestly, that deserves some recognition. If you're someone who enjoys a few quiet minutes in the bathroom, scrolling your phone, reflecting on life, or just hiding from your kids, congratulations. You're living in a golden age of hygiene. Because in the Middle Ages, the toilet was not a place of peace. It was a place of responsibility, odor, and the occasional heart-pounding moment. Let's start with castles, symbols of power, and, at least in theory, comfort. If you were a noble living in a grand stone fortress, congratulations. You had access to what was called a garderobe. Sounds fancy, doesn't it? In reality, it was a cold stone bench with a hole in it, perched high in a tower, sometimes with a windscreen, rarely with a door. Its main function? To let you do your business, straight into the moat below. Yes, the moat. That dreamy body of water you picture with swans and lily pads gently floating around the castle. In reality, it was the final destination for noble digestive waste. There was no flush, no scented candles, no charming stained glass windows, just the echo of your own thoughts and gravity. Now, if you think commoners had it worse, you're right. But not by much, because most common folk didn't have bathrooms. They had outdoor communal pits, or more realistically, a chamber pot under the bed. That's right, a ceramic, wooden, or metal pot, depending on your budget, placed just under where you slept, ready to receive your midnight confessions. On cold nights, there was no chance of going out into the snow or wind. You squatted quietly beside your straw mattress, trying not to spill anything, and hoping to avoid an unfortunate slip. It was a deeply intimate experience, especially since the whole family usually slept in the same room. And come morning, it was time to deal with the product. People would take the chamber pot outside, lean out a second-story window, and yell with all their might, "Garde l'eau," which in Old French meant "watch out for the water." A warning not just of what was coming, but a plea for survival. After the yell came the splash, a stream of liquid, sometimes warm, sometimes not, tumbling down into the street like gravity's cruel joke. And that was that. No sewage system, no sanitation trucks, just hope, patience, and a good pair of high boots. Public sanitation, it mostly relied on pigs. Yes, city pigs played the role of medieval bio-cleanup crews. They roamed the streets freely, snuffling through anything remotely chewable, and they weren't picky. Garbage, human waste, leftover food, and things you really don't want me to list. People relied on pigs to clean things up, like a four-legged grunting Roomba, except they left significantly more behind. Toilet paper? Oh, that's adorable. No, there was no toilet paper, no tissues, no smart bidet with air dry settings. The most common option? Straw, dried grass, or if you lived near the woods, leaves. If you were really lucky in winter, you might use snow. Not exactly gentle, but guaranteed to wake you up. In some regions, folks used seashells, rags, or, when all hope was lost, the sleeve of their own shirt. Sounds brutal? Maybe. But medieval people handled it. Because everyone was in the same boat. No one had a hot water bathroom. No one had vanilla-scented candles or an air purifier. There was only wind, stone, and an admirable level of grit. Kids were taught early how to handle things and avoid the danger zones. Adults knew which streets to walk down and which to steer clear of. The better neighborhoods, if you could call them that, were simply the ones where chamber pot dumps didn't fly out of windows every morning. To modern ears, it might all sound like a horror story. But for medieval folks, that was just daily life. In fact, when you think about it, yelling, "Guard low," before tossing out waste actually showed a sense of community. A little warning shared among people who were all just trying to survive together. And maybe, amid all the stench, the stains, and the midnight squealing of pigs, there was something undeniably human. They still lived. They still loved. They still dreamed, even without a flush toilet. In a world filled with indescribable smells, no showers, no deodorant, and pigs as sanitation workers, medieval people still found a silent savior. No, it wasn't perfume. It was linen. That's right. In an age where bathing was viewed with the same suspicion as blasphemy, the linen shirt became the thin, sacred line between a civilized human and a walking stew pot. Linen wasn't about fashion, no prints, no logos, but it absorbed sweat. It was soft, and most importantly, it could be washed. That made it the only natural deodorant accessible to the medieval world, aside from sheer hope. Here was the strategy. You didn't need to bathe your whole body. If the linen shirt underneath was changed often, the shirt would absorb the sweat, the grime, and part of your shame, while your body, it could just exist. No intervention required. And so, In that world of relentless discomfort, people learned to care more for their clothes than for themselves. A pristine white linen shirt, spotless, thoroughly washed, was a social statement louder than any noble crest. It said you had control, you had time, you had at least a nearby river. If you're thinking, it's just linen, what's the big deal? Imagine this. You're wearing 3 layers of wool, 1 layer of animal hide, and a metal belt, in the middle of summer, and you haven't bathed since early June. In that moment, linen was your last defense against becoming a slow-cooked soup of your own making. A simple, fragile layer, with a heavy mission. Absorb everything, so you don't steam yourself alive too soon. From knights to peasants, everyone relied on it. Knights, before suiting up in armor, always lined themselves with linen, not for the soft, silky feel, but to avoid roasting inside their own gear like a stuffed chicken. Monks, tucked away in quiet monasteries, wore linen too, not to impress anyone, but to keep their outer robes free from spiritual defilement. And peasants, even if their linen shirts were torn, patched, or barely held together by sheer willpower, they wore them. Because when you had nothing else, linen was survival. Washing linen was a ritual in itself. No washing machines, no floral-scented detergent from a faraway paradise. Just river water, rocks, and hands tough as shovels. People beat their shirts against stones, scrubbed them hard, wrung them out, hung them to dry, and occasionally prayed the river wouldn't sweep the whole thing away. That's why regularly washed linen was seen as a mark of wealth. You had a spare shirt, you had the time to clean it, and you had enough strength to do it without collapsing from exhaustion. In small-town communities, if someone stepped out wearing a bright white linen shirt, everyone noticed, like they had just walked into a fish market holding a brand new iPhone with the warranty still intact. It wasn't just a shirt. It was a status symbol, a declaration. I'm clean, at least on the surface. And the truth is, maybe they hadn't bathed underneath, but who could know? In a world without Instagram, the truth beneath your shirt was the only secret you could still keep. Of course, things weren't always perfect. Linen could crust over if not washed often enough. It could start to smell if dried indoors too long. And if you let it mold, congratulations. You just created the only living organism known to defeat lice. And yet, despite all its inconveniences, linen held its ground as the quiet hero of the medieval world. A humble layer of cloth that bore the weight of an age with no bathrooms, no hot water, no concept of bacteria, and plenty of body heat. So, if you're wearing a soft cotton tee right now, freshly washed in warm water, rinsed with lavender fabric softener, and tumble-dried on delicate, take a moment to thank the linens of the past. They absorbed every drop of our ancestors' despair, one sweat-stained thread at a time, and remember, to stay clean, You don't have to scrub the whole world. Just wash the linen underneath and pretend you're doing fine. If there was one thing more constant in a medieval person's life than prayer and the smell of raw onions, it was the itch. Itching wasn't an accident. It was a lifestyle. Itching was routine, a way of being. It was such a natural reflex that if you went 10 minutes without scratching, people might worry something was off with you. Welcome to the world of lice, nits, fleas, and all the tiny, determined creatures that never paid rent but moved in anyway. Uninvited guests who dined, napped, and partied like your body was a 3-star inn. The one fair thing, if you can call it that, was this. They didn't discriminate. Noble or peasant, monk or merchant, everyone itched. You could have a castle, a roaring fireplace, and a cloak trimmed with fur. But if you had hair and warmth, you had lice. And everybody knew it. No one boasted, "I'm louse-free," because that would be like bragging that you don't need to breathe. It just didn't happen. No one believed it. So what did medieval people do? 10. If you've ever sat watching a washing machine spin and felt grateful, hold on to that feeling. Because in the Middle Ages, laundry was an act requiring courage, endurance, and a strong stomach for foul odors. It all started with finding soap. Sounds simple? Far from it. Medieval soap wasn't the soft bar of Dove you use every day. It was a concoction of animal fat, usually pig grease, and wood ash. These two ingredients were simmered until they bubbled or even lightly charred, depending on the maker's skill and recklessness. The result? A hard gray brick, a smell so distinctive you'd wonder, am I washing clothes or performing an acid-base experiment? In fact, this soap was extremely effective at stripping away grease, grime, and any tender skin you might have had. That's why people rarely used it for bathing. It was too harsh, too rough, and too brick-like. Instead, it was reserved for laundry. And even that wasn't easy. Medieval washing didn't happen in tiled laundry rooms scented with lavender. No, it took place on riverbanks with stones, cold water, and simmering frustration. You began by soaking your garments, and this is where the fun really started. The strongest cleaner of all wasn't bleach. It was urine. That's right. Medieval people discovered that aged urine was alkaline, thanks to ammonia. And ammonia, surprisingly, could brighten fabrics, cut grease, and kill bacteria, or at least mask one stench with another. So households collected urine in barrels, let it ferment, and then submerged garments in it. In some large cities, they even taxed urine collection, because it was a resource. In others, dedicated collectors wandered from tavern to tavern, begging for pints of the stuff. Next, you'd take your 2-week worn linen shirt, soak it in the urine, then, just for extra romance, you'd beat it against a riverside rock. You'd lather it with your ash soap, fold it, beat it again. All the while, your fingers froze, the stench rose, and someone next to you was doing exactly the same thing with their trousers. If you were lucky enough to live by a clean river, that is, one not already contaminated by the previous laundry run. You could rinse your shirt a few times. If not, you faced a choice. Embrace the lingering odor of natural cleaner, or give it a quick rinse and pray it dried in time. Drying laundry in that era meant no metal wires or plastic clips. People used thorny branches or draped garments over tree limbs, fences, or rocks. And if it rained, good luck. A half-dry linen shirt, washed in urine, then soaked by rain. That was a life lesson you wouldn't soon forget. And remember, this wasn't just women's work. Everyone did laundry, monk or merchant, noble or peasant. Unless you had a personal servant, you knew the feeling of hauling garments out to beat against a rock. The servant, if you were lucky enough to have one, doubled as your laundry master. They gathered the clothes, soaked them, beat them, wrung them out, hung them to dry, all under unforgiving skies and amid rustic distractions. Pigs might wander by, dead fish might bob in the shallows, or, worst of all, a curious child might lean over and ask, "Why are you washing in that water?" For stubborn stains, blood, grease, or unidentifiable muck, people added sand, dry ash, or crushed brick dust. In other words, if the stain refused to budge, the fabric likely would, which explains why a shirt's lifespan was never long. But at least you could say you'd done everything possible, short of inventing the washing machine. If there was one thing medieval folks truly excelled at, it was patience. No 3-in-1 laundry pods. No vanilla-scented fabric softener. No quick wash, 30-minute cycles. They had ash, fat, urine, and hope. And through it all, they rose again, wrung out a still damp shirt, and carried on, slightly fragrant, but steadfast in spirit. Now imagine you could turn back the clock. Not to the 1980s, not to the medieval era, but all the way to 2500 BCE. That's nearly 4,500 years ago. And you're not stepping onto European soil or wandering around Egypt. You're in a parched, yet remarkably refined land. Mohenjo-Daro, the beating heart of the Indus Valley civilization. Never heard of it? No worries. The people of Mohenjo-Daro didn't have TikTok accounts either. But they did possess something many modern cities still dream of: a fully integrated sewage system. The moment you walk into the city, you sense something different. Not dragon different, but incredibly orderly different. Mohenjo-Daro's streets are laid out in a perfect grid, so straight and tidy that today's urban planners would envy it. No weird dead ends, no houses camouflaging sewers. Everything is logical, everything is clean, and it signals one thing: someone thought really hard before building this city. But the feature that truly blows your mind isn't the roads, it's the toilets. Every single house, big or small, has its own water well. And not only that, there's a covered brick-lined drain running from inside the home out to the street. Yes, wastewater pipes, flowing from your latrine straight into the covered public sewer. No open trenches, no muddy pits. Proper, capped sewers. If you'd just hitchhiked in from the Middle Ages, where people famously shouted, "Guard low," before tossing chamber pot waste out the window, Mohenjo-Daro would feel like an alien planet, a place where sanitation was a universal right, not an elite privilege. And don't think only the rich enjoyed cleanliness. Even the poorest here had access to hygienic wastewater disposal. No gilded palaces, no gold-clad elephant statues, just uniform brick houses, backed by infrastructure that would make modern civil engineers sit up, take notes, and nod in awe. And just when you think, surely they stopped there, you discover the ritual public bath. A large tank of water with steps leading down, lined with brick and sealed with bitumen to keep it watertight, meant not for swimming, not for rinsing vegetables, but for ritual purification, to cleanse the body and perhaps the soul. What does that tell you? It tells you that Mohenjo-Daro prized cleanliness so highly that they held ceremonies in pure water, while the rest of the world was still wondering whether water itself might be a disease carrier. You walk between those neat, orderly brick walls and suddenly realize no grand throne, no magnificent temples, no inscriptions boasting of conquests. The only declaration is in the thoughtful design, the clean streets, and the silent, working drains below your feet. This place doesn't shout, "I am great." It simply, quietly whispers, "I am clean." You don't find a royal seat, but you see hundreds of wells, each feeding water into every home, day after day. You don't find texts on power, but you see equity in the sewer system, where the poorest citizen could live without stepping over filth. You don't find statues of pride, but you find small bathing niches in each house, complete with drainage channels leading to the covered sewers. Simple structures, yet profound in their message. Cleanliness is part of living well. You look back at history and realize, sometimes civilization isn't measured by the size of its temples, but by how it handles its waste. And suddenly, you feel envious. You, living in an age of hot-cold showers, water purifiers, and sleep-tracking apps, find yourself jealous of people who lived 4,500 years ago because they built sewers that still work today. Of course, that civilization eventually vanished, like all beautiful things. We don't know why. Floods, climate change, politics, things that never stop happening. But what remains is their silent lesson. If you want to build a society to last, start by asking, where does the dirty water go? Once again, we turn back the clock. But this time, not to the itchy Middle Ages or the sacred tanks of Mohenjo-Daro. No. We arrive somewhere more splendid, more boisterous, and with an unmistakable flair for drama. Welcome to Babylon, 6th century BCE, the capital of the Chaldean Empire, where every brick seems to be shouting, "I matter." You've just passed through the Ishtar Gate. More than an entryway, it's an aesthetic manifesto. Glazed bricks in lapis lazuli blues, inlaid with lions, bulls, and mythical beasts, arranged as if someone in the Babylonian administration declared, "I don't just want a gate, I want a gate that makes the gods jealous." And then you step into the city. Think you've seen city streets before? Wait until you encounter the processional way, a broad, stone-paved boulevard stretching straight from the Ishtar Gate to the Temple of Marduk, the supreme god of Babylon. But it's not merely a road, it's a runway. This is where kings, priests, and ceremonial processions parade on sacred occasions, amid fanfares, chants, and perhaps a few knowing glances meant to say, "Behold me." You realize immediately, this city isn't planned for mere living. It's planned for display. Every street, every canal, every bustling marketplace is arranged with purpose. Houses don't spring up randomly. Districts are clearly zoned. Merchants here, scholars there, farmers over yonder. Everyone has a designated place and a reason to be there. In Babylon, you were never just a resident. You were a supporting actor in a grand, centuries-long play, staged by kings, crafted by architects, and perhaps guided by prophets who weren't always right. Then you stroll past the canals. They weren't merely for water. They were waterways for transporting goods, for irrigation, and in true Babylonian flair, laid out so that from above they looked like decorative patterns. You glance around the bustling markets, where people traded wheat, wool, and clay tablets etched in cuneiform, the emails of the ancient world. You might expect to hear vendors shouting. Instead, you hear the soft hum of mathematics. Yes, the Babylonians loved math even more than they loved cleanliness. If you've ever seen their sewer system, you know that's not exactly a compliment. Everything was recorded on clay tablets. Taxes, planting calendars, prophecies about Jupiter, and even recipes. Seriously. You feel as if you're walking through a colossal ledger made of brick, overseen by gods in robes. And then you arrive at the Temple of Marduk, tall, majestic, and unapologetically proud of itself. You don't need a tour guide, just look up. The temple is built as a ziggurat, stepped towers reaching toward the sky, as if Babylon itself dared to touch the stars. In fact, some say the Tower of Babel in the Bible was inspired by this very place, a monument so tall that the divine had to intervene, worried they might go too far. You exhale, not from exhaustion, but from awe. You stand in a city where every single brick tells a story, not of individuals, but of a civilization that believed beauty, order, and the divine must be woven together. And each night, as the sun sets behind the Ishtar Gate, The final rays catch those deep blue glazed bricks and reflect the golden lions running along the walls, as if the city itself is whispering, "Sleep now. Tomorrow, the performance begins again." If you've ever thought that modern cities with smart grids, straight boulevards, and hidden conveniences were a creation of the 21st century, you've never set foot in Mexico around 500 CE. Welcome to Teotihuacan, where ancient people looked up at the stars and decided to build a city to mirror them. The moment you enter Teotihuacan, the first thing that strikes you isn't the statues or the unusual scent of incense in the temples. It's the sheer straightness of the main thoroughfare, ominously named the Avenue of the Dead. Long as history's own exhale, it stretches from the Pyramid of the Sun all the way to the Pyramid of the Moon, two colossal symbols of the cosmos that these people worshipped with unmistakable devotion. Its name suggests an endpoint, where you go to meet your fate. But in reality, the Avenue of the Dead teems with life. Corn vendors, stone carvers at work, children darting about, and, of course, elaborate ceremonies to honor the heavens, with a touch of blood and a plume of smoke. This city was planned not only along celestial axes, but also divided into zones by social class, occupation, and religious preference. Want to live next to a potter devoted to the sun god? There's a neighborhood for you. A visiting Maya noble? There's a cosmopolitan enclave for international guests. Teotihuacan understood this. Civilization is knowing how to zone. Its underground drainage system would make many modern cities blush. While much of the ancient world was still tossing waste out the window, Teotihuacans mastered the art of channeling clean water into neighborhoods and ushering away sewage, neatly, odor-free, and without frantic yells of "watch out below" from upstairs. Their flood control canals are further proof of urban ingenuity. Instead of scrambling to bail out water when the rains came, they built channels to welcome rain like honored guests, courteously guided to flow away without soaking your bed. The strangest thing? There are no lavish palaces or towering statues of kings here. No signs of royalty flaunting power in the central plaza. Instead, every public space is devoted to the divine, centered around the temple of Marduk, the god of creation and cosmic order. It's as if the Teotihuacans believed, we don't need a king, we only need the stars. As you stroll along the paved streets, flanked by neatly arranged homes, you begin to feel overwhelmed. This is more than a city to live in. It's a universe recreated in urban form. A spiritual, material, and aesthetic ecosystem woven together in ways that defy belief. You stop before a relief depicting a man crowned with feathers, holding a musical instrument, dancing beneath the moonlight. No inscription explains it, yet somehow you understand. They lived with art, with rhythm, and with the conviction that this world must have order and meaning. And you start to feel a bit envious. Envious of people who lived thousands of years ago, yet built a city with a vision broader than Google Maps. Envious because they looked up at the sky and knew how to weave astronomy into daily life. Envious because while much of the world was still debating where to put toilets, Teotihuacan already had water channels running around every house, as if they were living in the demo version of an unimagined future. A city not built merely to endure, but to tell a story, in bricks, in stone, in carvings. A story told by sunlight streaming through the pyramid's peak on the equinox, by a road that marches straight toward the moon. And perhaps what makes Teotihuacan most memorable isn't the length of its avenue or the precision of its sewers, but how its people defined what it means to live together, with order, with diversity, and with a vision beyond what any human eye could see. You turn away, leaving a silent city behind, but in your mind, you find yourself asking, how did they do it? Then you smile, because even without Wi-Fi, without cars, without podcasts, they knew how to build a place that we still sit and talk about. Right before bedtime, you stand amid one of the most legendary cities of the ancient world, Babylon, around the 6th century BCE. Not a dusty desert outpost as Hollywood often portrays, but a vibrant, gleaming metropolis, paved with glazed brick and adorned with political power and architectural artistry. This city was more than a home to its people. It was a bold declaration from an entire civilization. We know urban planning, and we know how to flaunt it. The moment you pass through the Ishtar Gate, you're not simply walking through an entrance, you're stepping into a royal-style statement. Welcome to Babylon. Behold our sapphire blue and golden lions. Yes, both made of fired brick, and yes, we built them just to walk past every day. The Ishtar Gate was never just a gateway. It was the ancient world's Instagram in 3D brick form. From the gate, you follow in the footsteps along the processional way, not a mere pedestrian path, but a route reserved for gods, or at least for those who wanted to look godlike. This avenue runs straight to the heart of power, the Temple of Marduk. And if you're thinking, oh, it must be a simple stone shrine, think again. The Temple of Marduk is an architectural complex where ancient visitors came not only to pray, but to impress both the gods and their neighbors. What's astounding is that everything in Babylon is arranged as if the entire city were a grand stage. Every building block, every canal, every stretch of road sits with precision so meticulous, it's as if someone played Sim City without cheating. But instead of a mouse and keyboard, they used clay tablets. Babylon's planners had no digital tools, but they had enough patience and precision to rival even the most devoted bricklayer. You glance at the water channels, structures that not only direct flow, but spare villagers from rowing boats just to dump trash. Truly civilized. Neighborhoods are zoned with crystalline clarity. Areas for merchants, quarters for artisans, enclaves for nobles, and, of course, sectors for priests to perform rituals without competition from the dawn chorus. You begin to realize that in Babylon, urban planning wasn't merely functional, it was exhibitionist. The concept of, "Look how neatly we've organized our city," became a form of one-upmanship with the divine, as though Babylon's architects were sending a personal letter to the gods. "Behold what we've built. Surely you'll take notice of us." In a corner of the city, you might spot brickmakers at work, not because bricks have crumbled, but because Babylon never stopped building. This city functions like a machine in perpetual expansion, yet never a hint of chaos. Like a colossal Lego set carefully assembled by someone who actually read the instructions before snapping each block into place. Even more remarkable, Babylon's people didn't live solely to labor or to worship. They traded goods, they drank in taverns, they chatted about barley prices, and maybe griped about the cost of glazed brick. But from above, or in the theater of your imagination, you see a city not just organized, but imbued with brick-bound pride. Here's another twist. Babylon didn't overflow with palaces for a solitary king. Odd, since ancient empires usually vied to showcase their ruler. Yet in Babylon, instead of a private palace, they built public works, temples, walls, markets, as if to proclaim, "We, the community, are the greatest gift of the gods." Walking these streets, you won't encounter oversized statues of a monarch theatrically pointing off into the distance. You'll see polished pavements, ingenious sewer systems, and homes aligned in perfect proportion. If there was ever a place where architecture itself was a sacred act, it was Babylon. You pause by the canal, gaze at the water, and catch your reflection on red-glazed brick. You're not just a time traveler. You're walking through a story told in materials, each brick a letter, each street a sentence, the whole city an epic penned for the future. And in that quiet moment, you realize Babylon is more than a footnote in textbooks. It's a declaration that humanity can build order from chaos, art from dust, and hope from sun-baked bricks. You stand in Egypt in the year 130 CE. A breeze from the Nile stirs the palm fronds. It carries the sweet scent of grass, and something heavier, more elusive than rain, hangs in the air. The sky is clear, yet a weight presses down. A lone boat drifts silently on the water. Upon it, the Roman Emperor Hadrian gazes down at the river, where Antinous, his most beloved companion, has just vanished forever. Antinous's death was no ordinary accident, no eyewitness, no formal inquiry. Only one certainty remains: Antinous drowned. As for why, some whispered he sacrificed himself to spare the emperor ominous portents. Others murmured of a secret ritual, life exchanged for power. Yet perhaps that death needs no explanation. To Hadrian, only one truth endured: Antinous was gone. Antinous, a youth from Bithynia, was no noble by birth, no divine lineage, and yet he possessed what every Roman sculptor yearned to capture, a beauty so striking it seemed unjust. His face, with gentle lines that carried no weakness, his gaze, at once innocent yet concealing a secret, these features disarmed Hadrian amidst all his political calculation. When Antinous died, Hadrian did not weep before the court. He offered no lament to the gods. Instead, he acted, the only way an emperor could, with power. First, he founded a city named Antinopolis, right where his beloved had perished. Not merely a settlement, but a proclamation. This memory shall not be buried. Next, he deified Antinous. Yes, a god. While other deities governed war, love, harvests, or the sun, Antinous became the deity of mourning. He wielded no lightning, no bounty of crops, yet he commanded an empire and the emperor's own heart behind his cult. Statues of Antinous rose everywhere, a temple in Delphi, marble likenesses in Rome, his image stamped on coinage. No god of that age received so lavish a promotion as this newly born deity of grief. Can you imagine it? An ancient Roman empire, renowned for conquest and law, now honoring a brand new god, not for victory in battle, but for love. That isn't normal, and precisely because it's so out of the ordinary, it became legend. People burned incense to Antinous, not merely to seek blessings, but to remind themselves that loving someone so deeply you would make them divine perhaps needs no justification. Hadrian did not build a tomb. He built the Pantheon. He did not erect walls solely for defense. He built Hadrian's Wall to hold back bitter winds and wild beasts from the north, then spent the rest of his days contemplating in his Villa Adriana, where every room held a likeness of Antinous. They say Hadrian was an emperor of peace. He did not expand the empire's borders. He refrained from senseless wars. He devoted his life to uniting its reaches with stone bridges, libraries, and philosophy. But with Antinous, he did no philosophizing. He simply built. He built to remember. He built to preserve something that neither power nor time could protect: emotion. The world changed afterward. Other emperors rose to power. Statues of Antinous were forgotten, some destroyed. Antinopolis lost its former glory. Yet somewhere, if you visit a Roman museum today, you might still encounter that face, those eyes, gazing back at you as if he never drowned, as if he is still waiting for Hadrian to speak his name one last time. And you will understand. Love, once carved in stone, can span rivers, outlast centuries, and defy oblivion. It can become myth. It can, if it's retold tonight, carry you gently into sleep. You find yourself on a windless midday in the 2nd century, seated beside the man-made fish pond in Emperor Hadrian's villa at Tivoli, sipping grape wine and thinking, "This man truly loves the arts." And you wouldn't be wrong. Hadrian, who once strolled the length of the Roman Empire as though inspecting his own private park, was an emperor with a poet's soul, an architect's heart, and, when necessary, a god's vengeful hand. Don't let the clean toga and handwritten verses fool you. When Hadrian grew angry, maps were renamed, cities were burned, and history was rewritten, quite literally. We journey to Judea in 132 CE, where Hadrian decided that Jerusalem, a city sacred, steeped in history, and more tangled than any soap opera love triangle, needed a makeover. Not a touch-up on the streets, or a fresh coat of paint on the gates. No, Hadrian went bigger. He renamed the city Aelia Capitolina, a Roman rebranding move that might as well have said, "Greetings, Jupiter. Farewell, Jewish past." To the people of Judea, that renaming was akin to Hadrian pouring salt into an unhealed wound. If you ask, who reacts that strongly over a street name? Remember, to Judeans then, it wasn't just a name. It was identity, faith, a collective memory crushed under stone and Latin decree. And so, like any great ancient tragedy, they rose up. Leading the revolt was Simon Bar Kokhba, a leader whose name sounds like a background character in Star Wars, yet who became a symbol of hope. Under his banner, Jewish rights were restored. A new coinage was minted, and some sources say he even proclaimed himself the Messiah. A modest claim by classical standards. Hadrian, no longer content with poetic strolls, transformed into a general of cold steel, and not the let's negotiate kind of general you'd expect from the builder of the Pantheon. No, Hadrian struck as if someone had shattered his beloved statue of Antinous. He mobilized the full might of Rome, including legions that had crushed rebellious tribes across Europe. No negotiation, no compromise. Only fire, swords, and columns of smoke rising as though the god of war himself had descended to the earth. The rebellion was crushed, squelched as if doused by an iron club. According to historian Cassius Dio, over 500,000 Jews were killed. Judea lay in ruins, a shattered stage after a failed tragedy. Hadrian, seemingly unbowed, went further, renaming the province from Judea to Syria Palestina, as though to erase its name from the official record with cold Roman ink. And he didn't stop there. Hadrian outlawed many Jewish rites. No gatherings, no reading of the Torah, no sounding of the shofar. Every practice became a crime. Some say he did it in the name of order. Others see it as bitter retribution. But all agreed on one thing. No one dared make Hadrian angry, especially with legions ready to raise walls or raise cities at his whim. The irony is staggering. This was Hadrian, the emperor who revered Greek culture, celebrated beauty, championed peace, and memorialized his grief in stone for Antinous. yet who would now turn his hand to divide, oppress, and redraw borders with the sword. He was the emperor of monuments, and yet the destroyer of cities by his own proud decree. He brought learning to Athens, but banned the Torah in Judea. He penned poetry about love's immortality, yet authored a bloody chapter in a people's history. And you, standing amid the ashes of a Judean village, may wonder, did he ever regret it? No one knows. Hadrian left no memoirs, and statues do not grant interviews. Yet perhaps one night in the splendid Villa Adriana, by a moonlit pond reflecting marble likenesses, Hadrian sat in silence, not as emperor, but as a man trying to survive his own heart and the choices he could not undo. For sometimes history is not measured by what we accomplish, but by what we leave behind, the light and the darkness, and You find yourself on a windless May night in 1804, standing on the bank of the Missouri River. A gentle breeze stirs the edge of your hood, and in your hand is a blank journal. You are not alone. Before you stand two figures destined for history. Meriwether Lewis, so obsessed with botany he once sat for 8 hours just watching a squirrel jump, and William Clark, whose handwriting was so poor that historians still puzzle over each line. They carry no maps. There is no Google Maps. Instead, they bear a command from President Jefferson. Find the river, chart everything, and don't die. The journey begins like any great adventure. A heavy keel boat, a half-trained crew, and a heap of hazy hope. The boat glides along the Missouri. When it's not stranded on sandbars or pirouetting in whirlpools as if attempting ballet. Lewis peers through a spyglass, noting everything from cloud formations to where fish surface. Clark drives stakes into the riverbank, mapping with homemade ink that looks more like spilled coffee than borderlines. Each dawn opens a new chapter. Each dusk brings a mosquito battle, those fearless Western warriors defying water itself to carry pestilence. You might think mapping is merely sitting down and drawing a few lines, but in an uncharted wilderness, it means climbing trees to scout routes, falling, and climbing again. Lewis and Clark record not only rivers and mountains, they also annotate every slip, every detour around dead ends, every time the landscape resembles a map drawn by a cat. Luckily, the expeditioners are gifted storytellers. Around the campfire one night, you hear Lewis recount nearly being gored by a startled elk while sketching, and you can't tell if he laughs because he survived or because he gained a note. Extremely unfriendly elk. The region's flora is astonishingly diverse. You tread through meadows ablaze with wildflowers, each petal seeming to whisper a 3-line Latin name. Lewis, part country poet, part scientist, catalogs everything from sweet grasses to mushrooms that smell like damp footwear. Then come the fauna, skunks, gray bears, lynx, and a particularly bold squirrel that seems to challenge humanity by stealing jerky under cover of darkness. Lewis is thrilled. Clark is wary. And you wonder if that grizzly even realizes you're a tourist. Every creature poses an open-ended question. Is it poisonous? And will it eat you? If wildflowers and wildlife fired your spirit, the mountain climate soon had you drafting your will. Summers scorched like an oven. Winters. Imagine crossing the Rockies with knee-deep snow, water frozen in your canteen, and you brushing your teeth on sheer willpower. Hunger and thirst became your constant companions. When rations ran low, they ate jerky, then strange mushrooms, and, out of desperation, even candle grease. One night, Clark suspected their stew tasted like well-boiled soft leather. Lewis dutifully noted in his journal, perhaps with a disclaimer, "Not recommended." Then, the tiny nightmare began. Fleas. No folk song warned you that Missouri fleas are relentless. They leapt from blankets to coats, from hair to ears, from one man to the next, as though in an obstacle course. The comb was no longer for styling. It was a weapon. Scratching was no mere reflex. It was an art form. You heard the symphony of claws in the night. Some swore they heard a flea laugh, a claim unconfirmed, yet entirely believable if you'd lived with them for a week. At last, after hundreds of days, thousands of miles, and countless campfire tales, the expedition reached the Pacific. The ocean unfolded like a brand new map, vast, blue, and boundless. Lewis stood silent, eyes glistening, perhaps moved, perhaps salted by the sea breeze. Clark jotted in his journal, "Great sea, strong waves, we are weary." And you, standing between these two great explorers, realize that history isn't written in ink, but in mud, sweat, and fleas. You stand amid the rugged terrain of the American Northwest, where rolling mountains and icy rivers couldn't care less whether you're an intrepid explorer or a lost courier with a letter from President Jefferson. And there, amid the mud and the insects, emerges a hero with a baby strapped to her back. Sacagawea, a diminutive Shoshone woman, carried not only her infant, but the very survival of an expedition of white-coated gentlemen armed with notebooks, compasses, and dreams of immortality. She carried a living map in her mind. No paper chart, no GPS, only her memory, and an uncanny ability to recognize every stream and summit as if they were long-lost neighbors. It wasn't long before the polished men of the Lewis and Clark expedition realized Sacagawea didn't just know the way, she knew how to stay alive. While they panicked after nibbling on poisonous plants, she smiled and cooked them porridge from edible roots. When they froze at the sight of an unfamiliar tribe, she translated. She reassured them. No, these people aren't gods. And yes, they're harmless. They just get lost too. Then, as if history hadn't already tested them enough, the Nez Perce entered the story. This native tribe possessed everything Lewis and Clark lacked: food, warmth, and open hearts. When the expedition staggered into Idaho, ragged as laundry beaten on river rocks, the Nez Perce did not turn their backs. They offered help. They fed them. They sheltered them. And, most importantly, they guided them forward. No fees, no membership cards. Imagine, you unfold a map you can't decipher, and a local native says, "You'll need to cross 3 mountain ridges. Avoid that valley. It's bear country. And if you want to live, don't camp by that stream. Mountain lions hate uninvited guests." No apps, no Google alerts, only generations of oral memory. It was GPS, with a soul. But, as every true legend warns, there comes a price. And this debt wasn't measured in money, but in land, identity, and the survival of a people. After the expedition returned and redrew the world with triumphant fanfare, the very tribes who saved them watched their homelands slip away. Sacagawea became a symbol. Statues rose in her honor. Her name graced school books. Her visage adorned the dollar bill, an ornament of remembrance. But how many recall she never received so much as a formal thank you? She was more than a guide. She was the lifeline of those pathbreakers history lauded. And the Nez Perce? Once celebrated for their hospitality, they were driven from their lands as though a typo in the historical record. Soon after that great trek, federal policies forced them and countless other tribes off their ancestral territories in the name of progress. Progress measured in railroads, not in the wounds left behind. Did Lewis and Clark foresee these consequences? Probably not. When you've just survived blizzards, hacked through unknown forests, subsisted on root porridge, and kept one eye out for snapping alligators, you're unlikely to ponder the far-off fallout. But history remembers, and it records not only the victor's tale, but the spaces where the voices of the forgotten echo like a whisper against stone. Sacagawea never chronicled her journey. No memoirs, no podcasts, no medals. Yet imagine her years later, by a campfire, watching her child sleep, thinking, "At least I showed them the way," though they never remembered who led the path. You see, this story isn't about assigning blame. It's about remembering. So that before you drift off to sleep, you understand that every great journey has its unsung heroes. People too humble to earn statues, yet whose actions are the very reason statues stand. People whose names fade from common memory, but never truly vanish from history, though sometimes they only resurface in the quiet of a late-night YouTube tale. So you've traveled through the Middle Ages, where bathing was a nightmare, and wandered the streets of ancient cities that taught you urban planning. Hadrian, Lewis, and Clark remind you that history isn't just dates and battles, it's stories about people. What do you think of hygiene in days gone by? Comment and share your thoughts. And now, sleep well. Dream of clean rivers and flea-free baths. We'll meet again in the next chapter of history.